gave the keynote address. And for those of you who need an introduction, and I imagine there aren't that many at this point, Larry Summers was the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. And there in the late 1990s, he joined with Alan Greenspan to kill off the last serious attempt to regulate credit derivatives, the exotic flavors of investments that were at the center of our global financial crisis. And these days, Larry Summers works at the White House, where he is President Obama's primary economic advisor. And he was in Washington at this conference to talk about something I spent a lot of time exploring in my book. What is the appropriate intellectual takeaway from our financial crisis, and what should it tell us about policy going forward? Well, in discussing the crisis, he employed a metaphor that I think brings home this faith that this administration still has in a lot of the aspects of the market that have failed us in recent years. He suggested that policymakers should treat the financial crisis sort of like a plane crash. That was the term he used. He said, you know, it's like a plane has crashed, and we have to go to the scene of the crash, and we have to sift through the wreckage, and we have to find clues. What happened? Was it pilot error or structural problem? Let's figure that out so that we can get back to the system that generally works, but it didn't this time, and patch it up and get on with our lives. Well, when a plane crashes, we can safely assume that the pilot certainly had no interest in doing anything that would have increased the likelihood of a crash. We can safely assume that the airline couldn't have benefited from an air disaster. The travel agent that sold the tickets couldn't have benefited. The air traffic controller certainly had an incentive to decrease any risks of an air disaster. But in our financial crisis, that just simply isn't the case. It was not an accident. It was the direct result of the incentives that have been at play in our financial system and in our economy for 2 decades. In the case of our crisis, the equivalent of the airline pilots, which is to say the financial company executives, they were paid extravagantly to fly at dangerous altitudes before they ditched their planes in densely populated neighborhoods and parachuted safely down to the lawns of their private estates. And the equivalent of the airlines, which is to say the financial companies, they were really happy to be piloted by these cowboys because risk-taking made the stock price go up in the short term. And if the short term was sufficiently lucrative, that was really the only time horizon that mattered. And when the plane crashed, that was somebody else's problem. And the airlines effectively paid off the travel agents, if you were, think retail mortgage brokers, for their complicity, paying bonuses when they steered the passengers onto especially risky flights that would have been avoided by anyone who understood what was really going on. And the airlines effectively bribed the air traffic controllers, the credit rating agencies, who broadcasted that all was safe, and that allowed the dangers to build up unchecked while the airlines kept loading up passengers with paying customers and selling their shares at a premium. The point I'm trying to make is that a plane crash is generally an event for which there is no warning. Something suddenly goes awry in a system that previously worked fine. But our financial crisis came after a decade plus of warnings, and these were warnings that our leaders cavalierly dismissed in the interest of enabling the perpetuation of enormous profits and economic growth from a series of investment fantasies premised on the idea that risk had essentially been innovated out of the equation. And some of the key people who occupy senior roles in the Obama administration today, and who are now tasked with navigating us out of this crisis and toward a more healthy economy, well, these were the very same people who dismissed the warnings that got us here. That's a subject I'll return to in a little while. Now, I want to assure you, I'm not here to suggest that American finance has operated as some sort of sinister conspiracy, and I'm not even laying moral culpability at the feet of investment bankers. But I am trying to show that the crisis stemmed directly from the rules that shaped our markets, and everything that has happened in our financial system and in our broader economy over the last decade plus was the logical result of the incentives at work. And if we don't get those incentives straight, we're going to be here again. Now, I'm talking about the extraordinary growth of borrowed money the dereliction of lending standards, which enabled people who had no jobs, whose only attribute consisted of an ability to sign on the dotted line and attest to income that they may or may not have really had, to borrow money while paying no money, to borrow money to buy homes without paying anything down, and the ultimately catastrophic trading in credit derivatives. All of this resulted from a kind of cultish reverence for market forces. The idea that government was the problem. If you just got government out of the way and handed Wall Street over to the people on Wall Street, we would all benefit as a result. The systems of executive compensation at work on Wall Street tied bonuses to short-term stock performance, and the incentives played out by encouraging enormous risk-taking. And what is amazing, and what I hope you'll leave here with a strong impression of, is that all of these incentives, the same incentives that created the financial crisis, are still operative today. Nothing has changed. And despite a bunch of proposals that are now taking up airspace in Washington and are likely to take up more airspace in the wake of the passage of the health care bill, we can talk about the details of these proposals if you like later. But fundamentally, there doesn't seem to be grounds for any real hope that we're going to get to meaningful financial regulatory reform anytime soon. And if we don't replace these old incentives, if we don't put in place new incentives that effectively align the interests of the people who are running large financial institutions with the interests of the rest of us, taxpayers, homeowners, renters, working people, we're going to be here again, facing larger crises than ever. And as Larry Summers' plane crash metaphor suggests, the Obama administration's view of the crisis is simpler and more hopeful. We just have to clear away the wreckage. We have to identify the immediate cause of failure. We have to shuffle the regulatory chart of the regulators a little bit, task some people maybe to examine systemic risk, and then have faith that the system will get back to doing what it's supposed to do, making money move around in productive fashion. Well, instead of this metaphor, let me suggest that we scrap it, and let me offer you another one. This is the central metaphor in my book, and I think it's actually helpful in terms of understanding what's happened to us in our economy over the last decade plus. For far too long, our economy has existed in a state not unlike that of Neverland, that mythical land in the children's story, Peter Pan. Ordinary Americans have operated as if we can fly, borrowing extraordinary amounts of money while making believe that we can perpetually refinance our debts, that we don't really ever need to pay back the money that we borrowed. And Wall Street has enjoyed its own private island of unlimited adventure with minimal to no adult supervision. Well, Peter Pan in the story teaches the darling children that they can fly provided that they fill their minds with lovely, wonderful thoughts. And they have to believe in fairies, whose magic dust enables the transcendence of the basic laws of physics. During the tech boom of the 1990s, and then during the housing bubble of the next decade, this is how we operated in this country. We came under the thrall of a collective fantasy. First, this idea that the internet was such a transformative development, it was changing everything, disrupting traditional business models. We couldn't even measure the fantastic opportunities that were just falling from the sky. And when you can't measure something, the sky's the limit if times are good. And so stocks that nobody understood, that were never intended to be understood, skyrocketed in value, and it made a lot of people rich, and a lot of people borrowed